Hello and welcome to our Coptrz webinar today. My name is George Byrne. I'm from Coptrz, and I'm really excited to introduce Emily all the way from Seattle from MicaSense.
Yes, yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks, George.
Fantastic. So today we're basically going to be looking at your company MicaSense and all the products that you guys produce and supply across the world and the applications that they benefit. But before we go any further, just a bit of housekeeping. So anybody who's not new to the format of Livestorm, we have a chat, questions, and poll section on the right. It's always nice if people comment in the chat to say where they're listening from, what companies, where in the world they're listening from. But then if you've got any questions, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. But if there's any really pressing questions, there is a tab to vote them up, and hopefully we'll be able to keep asking questions throughout the webinar, and hopefully create a really good conversation and help you guys out. Just a little bit on Coptrz for anybody who is joining us for the first time. My name is George. I'm the inspection business development manager here. So we look after a wide range of products from DJI all the way to flyability, and obviously the MicaSense, which is one of our agricultural sensors. We work as a 360 drone solution here in the UK. Obviously the training equipment and the software as well. But today is all about MicaSense. So without further ado, I will hand over to Emily, who will take us from there.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, George. And yeah, feel free, echoing what George said, feel free to ask any questions as well as we come up. He'll be monitoring that. I'm happy to kind of pause and explain further if there's something of interest. So my name is Emily Shashelski, and I'm a channel sales manager with MicaSense. So we work with Coptrz in the UK as our premier partner. So happy to be partnering with them on this webinar, providing more details on multispectrals and what their benefits are, how they're best used. And so I'll dive in a little bit here to the agenda quickly. I'll be providing a brief overview about MicaSense as a company, then a brief overview about the multispectral sensors and that technology, and then the majority of the presentation will be about applications. So I've highlighted some applications in forestry, specifically some enterprise research and environmental monitoring. And then I'll pass it over back to George for an overview on Coptrz offerings with our sensors. Since we're just the sensor component of it, Coptrz is able to provide the full solution as far as drone integration kits and software.
Fantastic.
All right. So MicaSense, we are an ag eagle company. We're in the US, based in Seattle. You can see a picture of our team there. And the way that we're able to have such a global presence is through our reseller network, through Coptrz, partners like Coptrz. And what we focus on at our team is designing sensors that are going to be as light as possible. Since they are flying on drones, we want to maximize flight time, low power pull. We also want to keep them platform agnostic. So we have, for instance, DJI integration kits, since those are very popular. However, we're trying to have a sensor that can be integrated into a variety of platforms. So there's options for custom integrations if customers want to do that. There's also a number of fixed wing manufacturers that integrate our payloads. So on the drone integration side, we like to keep it very agnostic, as well as on the processing side. So we keep the data very open. We have a lot of research customers. So for that reason, we even have a GitHub that you can go through and do Python scripts for some of the first steps of processing for those that really want to have full control over their data. We also work with all the industry leading software providers when it comes to photogrammetry software that can take the images, raw images from the camera, calibrate them, and stitch them into a map. So that's something that we, is very important to us.
Fantastic.
So a brief overview on the multispectral and what it's actually recording, what the data is. I've got a graphic on the next slide that explains that a little bit. So basically, this kind of sensor is used for any kind of plant health mapping. So a lot of times the focus can be on agriculture for that, but really it can apply if you're looking at any kind of vegetation. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the sunlight's beating down on the plant. That's either then being absorbed by the plant and used for photosynthesis. It can be transmitted through the leaves, or it can be reflected back up. So the light that's reflected back up is what this sensor is capturing. And it's not just the RGB in the visible range. We're going into a portion of the light spectrum that's not visible to the human eye, but is what plants reflect the majority of. So that's the NIR in this graphic here, the near infrared range. So our sensors have a red edge band and a near infrared band that are both not visible. And that information is really helpful when looking at early signs of plant stress before the leaves are starting to yellow and show visible signs of stress.
Brilliant, because you've also got sensors with thermal cameras and obviously visual cameras on as well, haven't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. We do have one of our sensors incorporates both the multispectral and the thermal aspect of it. So it's even farther down the light spectrum, looking at the long wave infrared for the thermal. And that is good for looking at water stress across a field, anything that's irrigated, looking at those irrigation systems at a large scale.
Fantastic.
So yeah, both the in that case, both the RGB visible, visual cue reference overview of the area being flown, the multispectral for the plant health analysis, and then the thermal looking at water stress. This graph here shows a little bit about diving a little bit deeper into how do these, red edge and near infrared band, how is that giving us information on plant health? This helps explain that. So the graph here is a typical reflectance curve for plants. So typically a healthy plant will be this green line we see here. In the visible light spectrum, it's reflecting the most in green. So it's why you see the increase there. Low reflection in blue and red. And that's because the plants are absorbing a lot of that light for photosynthesis. And then a ton of reflection in the non-visible light. So that red edge and near infrared spectrum. And then as a plant gets stressed, whether it's water stress, a pest issue, disease, that will start to affect the reflectance. So that's what we see in the dotted red line there. We'll start to see more reflection in blue and red since the plant's not utilizing that as effectively for photosynthesis, and then a decrease in the near infrared reflection as well. So that's how we're able to really pick up on those, knowing those properties, how we're able to pick up on those early signs of stress using various vegetation indices that are available. NDVI is one that's commonly used for looking at biomass. So as plants are growing and maturing, and then NDRE is one that's more correlated with chlorophyll content. So if you're looking at mature plants, it's one that's helpful for that.
Fantastic. And for anybody who's watching this, maybe on a smaller screen, we will be recording this and we will be putting on YouTube. So all of the graphics and everything that has been recorded today, you'll be able to pull off at a later date. If you miss anything, that is, or you can give us a call and obviously ask myself or Emily any questions. But no, moving on. Should pop up now. There we go.
Great, thanks. So for this graph, I wanted to show just a brief overview of what is the raw output you're getting from the camera. Since it's not going to be a live stream like you might see with, might be familiar with other drone systems that have RGB sensors. So everything is done in post-processing, and that's when you'll get a map that would then be, the piece of information you're using to, act on, basically getting the insights from that map instead of a live stream. So the raw output here is going to be grayscale images, and that's what you're going to get from each band. So with a multispectral sensor, typically you're going to have multiple imagers. In our case, we have 5 imagers, for instance, for our red edge sensor, and that's each imager is dedicated to one band. So we have one imager for the blue, the green, red edge, and near infrared. So every time the camera is capturing, you're going to get 5 different images. And then what happens in the post-processing is those images are calibrated. That's a very important step for multispectral imagery. And something that's unique compared to RGB, for instance, is there's a light calibration component. And that's because since we are looking at that reflection value, that is going to be impacted by sunlight conditions. So during a flight, it's likely going to be changing. From flight to flight, it's definitely going to be changing. So it's really important to calibrate that imagery. We do that. We provide 2 pieces of equipment with our sensors that are used for that. A light sensor that is capturing every second or every time the camera is capturing below, and then a panel. So that panel, it's a white material. We know the reflectance values in all 5 bands for that, and we can use that to process the imagery. So all of that is automatically, that calibration is all behind the scenes, basically, in the processing software, in addition to stitching all of those images together into a map. So that's a general workflow for the multispectral imagery, and the steps that are taken to get to that final map.
Fantastic. And you obviously mentioned processing, and calibration is really key. So obviously, if you were to look at the drone, the main sensor fits on the bottom. What would you see on the top?
On the top is where the light sensor is. So in our case, it's called the DLS2, downwelling light sensor. And so that's where the GPS as well. There's an embedded GPS there. So that's how we're geotagging all of the images and able to, process them later. It's also got 12 different sensors on it, and that's what's used to be measuring not only the sunlight intensity, but also, where is the angle of the sun, or where is the sun in relation to the drone. So that's all the sensors are at slightly different angles for that reason.
Fantastic. We've actually got a good question. What software would you be using to process that imagery? If we go on to that, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to just answer that now, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah, there's Pix4D Fields is a really nice one because they have a very simple workflow. And then for those that want like full control over their processing workflow and really want to customize, mostly in the research space, Pix4D has a Pix4D Mapper version. There's a company, the Agisoft, that has another processing software. There's a number of different options. I would say Pix4D and Agisoft are probably the most common.
Brilliant. Good stuff.
All right. So diving into the applications, I wanted to start off with forestry. So, these are specific examples, sample imagery and case studies from our sensors, but they can really be, like I was saying earlier, they can really be applied to any kind of vegetation management. So just something to keep in mind. So for forestry, I'll start off talking about disease monitoring specifically, and then I'll go into some stand counting examples and quantifying damage after a weather event. So in the first example here, we've got disease monitoring. And in this case, this was Altea out of France. They not only provide processing services, but analytics. That's their focus, is they do custom analytics. And in this case, they were working with a forestry company that had a bark beetle infestation, very common issue. And they wanted to map basically the level of infestation and the extent of the infestation to do sanitary cuts, to try and salvage the rest of this, the trees in this specific stand. And so what they did is they flew with our sensor, and using that red edge and near infrared information, they were able to get some tree health assessment. And that's what you see in the bottom image there. So in the background is the RGB composite, and then later on top is the plant health information, essentially. And so they've only highlighted, in most of these softwares, you can basically threshold the values. So you're only looking at low readings for plant health. And that's what they've done here. They've highlighted the areas with the poorest health, and then they've created a vector map in red to highlight, specifically what are the boundaries of these areas that we want to send crews in and cut these areas. So the added benefit of having this map and being able to create this, these vectors, is that you're going to able to get an exact read of, what is the acreage basically that's reading as low health, what is the percentage of the stand that has been affected. And since it's all geotagged as well, they can have this map pulled up and send crews and guide to these specific areas for cutting. So really nice to have, in this case, the full aerial overview of what's happening in the stand before making a decision around where to do cutting, whether to do, clear cut this whole area, or in this case, to do more targeted cutting to salvage the rest of the stand.
Yeah, absolutely. The geotagging element of it, I must be, so time saving for a lot of, people on the ground. Send them a coordinate and then they go off and do the job. That's brilliant.
Exactly. And at a more, in this case, they're doing large areas that they've highlighted, but the geotagging, like you're saying, works really well for, spot inspections as well. So in a lot of cases, you can even, drop a pin in a specific area and then even upload a photo from the ground that somebody took. If there's, something like, hey, let's investigate this further, you can take photos. And in a lot of cases, the softwares will allow you to just upload to that, have it correlate with that specific spot so you can reference it later.
Brilliant.
And then the second example here is doing stand counting, but specifically looking at stand counting with young trees at a stage where, the trees are only maybe, in this case, they were 3 years old. So they're quite small still, and there's a lot of competing vegetation around. So in that case, it can be more difficult to do a stand count with just an RGB sensor, since, everything being red as green is more likely to be, counted in that case. Whereas if you use the multispectral imagery, you're able to hone in a little bit better on, we just want to see the trees in this instance. Typically, there'll be a little bit of difference in the reflection between different species. And so that's another thing to point out, actually, is so we have 3 different sensors, and the 2 of them have 5 bands. So the ones that I showed earlier, the red, green, blue, red edge, and near infrared. But we do have another system that has 5 additional bands, so total of 10 bands. And that's something that is really useful when you're doing species classification. So that could be looking at invasive weeds. It could be, like in this case, separating out competing vegetation from, a pine tree that you're trying to count. And essentially what that's looking at is mostly in the near infrared range, you're going to see more slight differences in reflectance between different species. So that's another example of where the multispectral can be useful. In this case, like I was mentioning earlier, it's a 3-year-old stand, and we're able to do an automated stand count using a CIR composite in the background. The RGB is what you see visually, but in the background to do the stand count, we use CIR, which is a false color composite, and it's saying for the near infrared band, since it's a color that we can't see, let's assign it a color. And in this case, it's red. So in the CIR composite, anything that's a vibrant pink is going to be really healthy vegetation. Soil is going to be more of a tan kind of gray color. So that's what was used in the background, and we were able to do an automated stand count using that, as well as information on a typical diameter of what you'd expect for these trees. So I think this one is a GIF that it will show the automated count, but it might be stalled at the moment. But that's the idea there, just to.
Yeah, I think it is stalled. So for anybody who is wondering what the sort of the plain photo is seeing, this would be what an RGB camera would see. But then obviously with the MicaSense side of it, with using your added sensors, it basically goes along, and because of the different colors and all of the different intensities, it'll basically count that for you and give you a figure of the area. Is that along the right lines, Emily?
Yep, exactly. So once again, being able to have that full aerial overview instead of just what would be more traditionally done of, pulling up on this forestry road and doing a selected counting of the trees in that, immediate vicinity, and then extrapolating based on that. So in this case, you're able to fly the whole area, see everything. There's no extrapolation that needs to happen to get accurate count. So that data can then be used either to determine if any replanting needs to be done, or if there's areas where the trees are too growing, too closely together and need to be thinned out a bit. So that would be the specific application here.
Brilliant.
This is another example of that as well. In this case, it was to identify any gaps if there needed to be any replanting. So this is a separate area that was flown, but similarly young trees. So we're looking at a zoomed out even farther to a larger area in this instance. So you can see, with the trees being so young, how difficult it is to see in the RGB because there's a lot of soil that's kind of dominating the picture here. So the next slide will show the multispectral. Well, this is the multispectral with just the RGB. And then in this slide, we're looking at NDVI. So that's what I mentioned earlier in the presentation, where it's looking at biomass. So anything that is showing up as high biomass is going to be a dark blue. And then anything that is soil, really low values for NDVI is going to be green. So you're able to see a lot more clearly, especially on the left-hand side of the road where the tree is a little bit older and more mature. You can see that spotted in blue. And on the right, the main area of interest, you can start to see those pinpricks of blue where the young trees we're wanting to count are.
And with the obviously post-processing software, you'll be able to calculate all of those. So it wouldn't be a case of going through them and actually counting them up yourself. You'd be able to do that with the software, right? Yeah.
Right. Yep. Correct. Yeah. So the next slide will even show a little bit more. We did some further analysis with this one. So in this case, we thresholded based on the diameter that we expect for these trees. So everything that we'd expect to be the young trees is highlighted in blue. Anything that's larger than that is in purple. So just as a first step to kind of filter out the data a little bit, to your point of kind of automating the analytics. And then in the next slide, we'll even show one step further. We took that data then and created a heat map, essentially. So we wanted to see where is there concentration of vegetation and where are there gaps where it's just soil. So the main output that we're looking here is where there are gaps. So that's what's highlighted in red. So in this case, the gaps are really not big. There wouldn't need to be any replanting done. On the right-hand side, there's that one spot where it's a little sparse, but really it's looking pretty good. So this would be, in this case, you're flying, you're getting this data, but this would be the output that's actually, utilized by the forester who's actually going to this area and wanting to make a decision about replanting. And then the last example we've got here is quantifying damage. So in this case, it's after a hailstorm, but it could be after any weather event. I've also seen there's some insurance companies that are starting to use multispectral for this reason. So it could be in agriculture as well as forestry. But basically, if after a weather event that's causing damage, to quantify what that is using the multispectral imagery. So in this case, our partner in Poland, they flew this area for a local forestry district after a hailstorm. And on the left-hand side is the CIR composite. So that's the one I mentioned earlier, where you're going to see healthy vegetation is bright pink. And then anything that is dead or dying is, in this case, going to be a very gray, muted blue. So you're able to see there's quite a bit of damage looking at the CIR composite. And on the right-hand side, they took it a step further with the analytics. And this is primarily a pine forest. That's what the species of interest was. So they classified out those different species because there's a little bit of birch, oak trees, beech trees in there. So they wanted to highlight those differently. So you're able to get a reading on that using the multispectral imagery. And then on a secondary level, apply the tree health status as well. So that's what this legend shows. If we're looking just at the pine, that's the first, 4 or so fields. And healthy trees for pine are going to be green. Weakened trees are yellow. And then the ones that they were interested in as damaged and dead, that's what they wanted to quantify. So that's in orange and red. So in this case, it ended up being 13% of this forest stand that was damaged and dead due to the hailstorm.
No, but well, that's just fantastic data that you can pull off well, relatively quickly. What sort of time processing? So let's go from the start of this, because this is a great application. From turning up on site, sending the drone up, doing the map. How long would that side of it, the actual capturing of data, how long would that take usually for a size this site?
I can't remember how large this area was specifically, but typically, like for the Matrice 300 drone, for instance, you'd probably get like a 30-minute flight time with our sensors. So if you're flying at like 120 meters, you'd be able to cover 30 minutes, about 100 acres with that. So depending on the area, you can swap out batteries and fly even longer. And then when it comes to processing the data, some people can, it depends on the application. I would say in this one, they probably, came back and processed overnight, and started looking at the next day. In other cases, if it's really important, just because for this forestry example, it wasn't important to have the data immediate turnover. But in some agricultural applications, it is. So in those cases, using something like Pix40 Fields that can do a quick stitch of the imagery. So something you can do right after you fly and get it processing, just standing next to the car before you're even going back to the office, and getting that data processed. So it does depend a little bit on how quickly the data needs to be turned around. But for more, I would say for more in-depth analytics like this, it is going to take a little bit longer. So it's not the immediate kind of field side processing that you might see in other places where you just want to see CAR composite on the left-hand side, for instance, or you just want to see NDVI. So yeah, I hope that.
But still, to capture that much ground in 30 minutes is fantastic.
Yeah, definitely.
Hello. Yes. Yeah. Still with us. Fantastic. Brilliant. We'll move on.
All right. So for the next couple of examples, I want to talk about enterprise research. And I call it enterprise because some of it can be universities that are doing different trials. Some of it are private companies that are developing new seed varieties or new inputs. So any kind of research where you're doing a trial plot setup, where you've got control plots, and you want to analyze the performance of these plots over time. So that's where the calibration again comes in and is very important, that you're able to calibrate this multispectral imagery. So if you're flying multiple times throughout a season and you are wanting to, quantify the performance of each plot over time, you're able to do that with this calibrated data. So this is an example from a case study out of Hungary, I believe, and these were primarily winter wheat plots. So on the left-hand side is the RGB composite from one of our sensors, and on the right-hand side, we're looking at NDRE, I believe in this case, so more correlated with the chlorophyll content. So using that as a correlation with health, the highest values for that are going to be green, and then the lower values yellow, and very low readings would be in red, or in that case, it would be soil. So you can already see the variation between the performance of the different plots that is not immediately clear from the RGB on the left. And the next slide will show, can zoom in even closer to see the level of detail there. So yeah, in this case, this was a fungicide trial. So they were applying fungicides to combat powdery mildew. And the plot, the micro plot that's highlighted here is one that didn't receive any fungicide application. So you can see how much it's affecting the plant growth in that area. And even just from plot to plot, ones that are more similar, in their, as far as the treatments they've received, they have more subtle differences, but you can still pick up on those readings with the NDRE map. In a lot of cases for this kind of research, although the visual map is helpful, a lot of times what people actually utilize when they're analyzing the performance is an Excel sheet. So even just saying, okay, for this microplot specifically, what was the reading, the average NDR reading for this plot? So you can set up the boundaries, create boundaries for each specific plot, and then average the values that you're getting for those plots. And then you can look at the average value from flight to flight to flight and see the performance based on that.
Brilliant. And obviously this is a huge application at the moment with research facilities. I know we work with it, but we supply this sort of equipment to a lot of sort of like British Sugar, BBRO, who's another big one, who are using it for exactly this sort of application and testing out either plant cycles or fertilizers or all these sort of different things. So yeah, some really great data to come from this.
Yeah, definitely. And then the last examples I'll share for environmental monitoring, just talking about reclamation, land reclamation, looking at monitoring environmentally sensitive areas, and then recovery efforts as well after weather events. So for the reclamation example here, basically recovery of land to its more natural state. So whether that's after mining activities or oil exploration, or whether it's an area that maybe it's a contaminated site for whatever reason, polluted site that they want to have some reclamation of, really helpful to have the full aerial overview of what's happening in this area, how the regeneration is going, and if there needs to be, there needs to be removal of invasive species, if there needs to be, if they're trying to do, planting and proliferation of more native species, monitoring that, the effectiveness of that. And so in this example, we're looking at, this is up in Canada, a boreal peatland is the landscape we're looking at here. But this is an area that had been used for oil exploration or for tar sands, I believe. And so on the left-hand side, you can see an area that was more recently cleared. And on the right-hand side was an area that they're, halfway through the reclamation process. So you can already see very quickly in this multispectral view on the right-hand side, it's starting to resemble a lot more the undisturbed area around it with the mixture of two different tree species there. And so that's just to, show in this case, they were using the multispectral imagery to do a species classification because they did want to make sure that the composition between different tree species is what they'd expect to see in undisturbed land in that area. So helpful not only for these reclamation efforts as they're underway, but also helpful from a regulatory standpoint in a compliance standpoint. Depending on the area they're in, there's different regulations on how far the reclamation process needs to be before the company is able to move on to a different area. So in this case, the multispectral is really nice to not just have limited ground truthing areas that you're able to extrapolate, based on that. In this case, you're able to look at the entire area that you've mapped and provide this, quantitative information on the recovery efforts.
And I guess that goes into sort of forest clearing as well. There's all sorts of deforestation, which lumber farms, that sort of thing, which will this have a huge application for.
Yeah, definitely. That's helpful for that as well. And then the other example is environmentally sensitive areas. So in this case, I'm thinking of parks, areas that are, in most cases, protected by government because of, the sensitive ecosystems that are in those areas, things like that. And so in this case, what we're seeing is this is near us in Washington State, and it's mostly lots of small grasses in these areas. You can see the most vegetation is in the streams that have formed between these two hills. So that's what you see in blue there. It's NDVI reading. And for the low values, we just made those transparent. So anything else that has a low reading, it's not going to show up as red. We're just having the RGB show through for that. But in this case, what they wanted to do was there's lots of non-native grasses that have kind of taken over the landscape. And so they outcompete all of the native bunch grasses as well as wildflowers and whatnot. So this is an area that previously had been used for grazing and then had been neglected for many years. It's now part of a state park. And so they're having efforts to have regeneration of native species. So they're doing selective grazing in these areas to basically the cows will eat all of the non-native grasses and give a chance for these native bunch grasses and wildflowers to grow. So in this case, it's a large area that we're looking at. So if you zoom in, this is on our website as well, to see specifically, you can start to see the readings for the small grasses, but that's something in this case to guide where they want to send to have the cattle for grazing, where areas where the native vegetation there's a lot more, biodiversity happening, and they can, count it as reclaimed essentially. So really helpful in this case, for looking at the regeneration of an area where there's lots of invasive species happening, and they want to reclaim it to a more natural state.
Brilliant.
And then the last one, we're looking at recovery efforts. So somewhat similar to the forestry example, looking at quantifying damage after a weather event. However, in this case, more geared towards long-term, not just a immediate quantification, but long-term analysis of how is the vegetation recovering. So in this case, it's after a wildfire. This is in California. And one of our customers, USGS, government organization, was using the sensor to monitor vegetation recovery after a wildfire that had broken out. And in this case, they're using both the multispectral imagery as well as the digital surface model. So that's another output that you can get from the multispectral sensor, a general digital surface model to show elevation change. In this case, that was really important because it's a pretty hilly area. And in addition to the vegetation recovery and species diversity that they wanted to look at, they also wanted to make sure areas that are high erosion risk, because they're on a steep slope, that there's vegetation recovery in those areas. So they're able to use the multiple different data outputs they're getting from the sensor here to monitor recovery.
Brilliant. Yeah, we had a lot of fires over the last couple of years, actually. So especially with flooding as well, they have a huge impact on the environment. Obviously, I don't think it was as bad as some places in Australia and obviously California, but still pretty bad.
Yeah, and it's interesting to use as well for kind of more preventative measures also. So flying, identifying areas where they cut down trees as a fuel break if there were to have another wildfire outbreak, to slow down the spread of the fire. So multiple different applications there.
Yeah, fantastic. No, Emily, brilliant. I had some really great information. We have got some questions to go through.
Sure.
If anybody hasn't already, stick your questions in the questions box. I think there was a few people who are having trouble connecting. If you just refresh, you should be able to log back on straight away. But as I said earlier on in the webinar, we will be recording this and sending the recording out, and probably cutting down a few of the clips for our YouTube and whatnot. But Emily, obviously we've looked at a lot of applications there, and I'm imagining there's a few answers for what I'm about to ask you. But best time of day, best weather conditions. What's the optimum sort of conditions and environment to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our recommendations there are, as far as time of day, flying within 2 hours of solar noon. And the reason for that being to avoid deep shadows. So what we want to avoid is having deep shadows that are casted on the area that you want to be mapping and do analytics on, because that is very difficult to correct for. And then you're also getting the maximum sun intensity because you're measuring the reflection. It's a passive sensor, so it's relying on that sunlight to get a good reading. And then as far as weather conditions, which is going to be most ideal is either completely sunny or overcast. So anything that's more consistent lighting or universal kind of lighting. So uniformly overcast, completely sunny. What's going to be difficult to correct for is if it's a sunny day, but there's some large clouds, we call them popcorn clouds, that are floating over, and casting deep shadow onto some areas of the field and leaving other areas, very brightly lit. So that is something to consider for any kind of multispectral imagery. That's always going to be something to avoid. So yeah, either sunny or overcast. And on a sunny day, we recommend, as far as the processing and the calibration workflow, we recommend using our panel, just the panel on the sunny day, since it's going to be slight changes in lighting conditions there. And then on a overcast day, to use both our light sensor and the panel. That's really what the light sensor is developed for, is for those cloudy, overcast conditions where there's a lot more changes in the illumination, and you need a more robust calibration in those cases.
Brilliant. And a question which is maybe more aimed at sort of what we do here, but it's on the compatibility of the sensors. What drones are best suited? I know you mentioned the Matrice 300, but also sort of fixed wings. You started fitting the MicaSense equipment to fixed wings as well, haven't you?
Yes. Yep. Like the Wingtra 1 carries our payloads. Quantum Systems, our Trinity VTOL as well. SenseFly carries our Red Edge MX. We've got a full list on our website as well. There's a drone solutions page that you can see for, because in addition to the fixed wings, there's a couple different quadcopter solutions as well, smaller companies that have integrated our sensors.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the main thing is because of the weight of the camera, be it the Red Edge, the Alton, whatever it may be, you need something with a decent carry load, a weight capacity to carry the sensor. So unfortunately, it does rule out the Mavic Air or pretty much any of the Mavic systems. But something even like the Inspire 2, the Matrice, and like you said, the Wingtra in the fixed wing, because as good as a quadcopter is, having a fixed wing system, you're going to cover a lot of ground very quickly. So as you said, you mentioned 30 minutes with the Matrice, 100 acres. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
You could. I imagine you could cover a lot more with the Wingtra.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. They've got the longer flight time. They're able to have with the fixed wing aircraft to cover a larger area, for sure.
Fantastic. Going on to the next one, and this is more on the integration side. Now that you've released different sort of versions of the cameras with the Skyport. So it's sticking specifically to the M300. How does the integration work? Because you can get a standalone unit which comes with like a quick mount, but how does the actual Skyport version, which fits into the software, work with your systems?
Yeah, the Skyport is going to be our most streamlined integration. So we are using a DJI Skyport as the way to mount the sensor. So it'll just twist and lock onto one of the gimbal ports on the M300. So that will connect it to the power source. So the drone will be powering the camera. It'll also connect the camera to drone communication. So in most other integrations for the standalone units you mentioned, the camera is being powered by the drone in many cases, but it's acting independent of the drone. So it's just set up, you can access, there's a Wi-Fi interface on the camera, so you can access it with your phone or a tablet, and you set it up in, there's a couple of different triggering modes, but it's self-triggering. So it's going to be, once you take off and you reach within 40 meters of your desired flight altitude, it's just going to start capturing. In the case of the Skyport, though, you are connected to drone communication, so it's not acting independently, it's being controlled by the drone, which is nice as far as the workflow, because it simplifies things. And it's an extra assurance since there is no live stream from the sensor. When you're flying, you're able to see not only the countdown as images are taken, but also there's a shutter noise that you hear in the DJI mission planner as the drone is flying. So extra assurance that everything is working properly and the drone is triggering the camera.
Brilliant.
Sorry, I was realizing there's one more benefit of the Skyport that's actually new. So I'll mention that as well. Since the Matrice 300 does have the RTK capability, now through the Skyport, you can access that. So instead of using the standard GPS that comes with our light sensor to geotag the imagery, you can override that and use the RTK from the drone. So you're using much more precise geotagging by using the RTK down to the centimeter level instead of the meter level with a standard GPS. So that's another big benefit of the Skyport.
Yeah, fantastic. Huge talking point, especially here in the office, that when that was released. So, no, fantastic. Going on to something a bit more technical, how accurate is the DSM rendered from the MicaSense sensors as compared to conventional RGB derivative photogrammetry?
So it's not going to be as detailed as something you'd get with a really high resolution RGB camera. But it will give you a sense of the general elevation changes. So either across a field or in the forestry example I showed, the hilly area there. So we've got a data gallery on our website that is useful to look at. And there you can see lots of sample imagery and get a sense for across a variety of landscapes what that ends up looking like.
Brilliant. And is there any sort of portal or data log of where there's published guidance on sort of the algorithms, process approaches, or vegetative species discriminations? So I know a lot of it can be up to sort of interpretation of the user, but do you have sort of a guide to what you're looking at with different species, etc.?
So on our knowledge base, we have a general guide on what are various vegetation indexes that are really commonly used. What are the formulas and what is the information telling you? So that's a good place to start. For the more advanced stuff about the species classification and whatnot, our YouTube channel is a good place to go there. Our sales engineer has uploaded a number of different videos of different data sets that he's analyzed, including the forestry, the stand counting one that I shared. So there's information on how he did that stand count, as well as the beginnings of, I don't think he's done a full one on the classification, but kind of the beginnings of how that would work. So that would be a good place to look for. That would be the MicaSense YouTube channel.
Fantastic. It's always a good answer to say, check out our YouTube, because that's a good knowledge base. I've used that a few times. Too. Yeah, it's always a nice one to use. And finally, we've got one last question. How does the system cope with different terrains, i.e. topographies? They've used the example rolling hills. How would it differ?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So for that, you would want a drone that has terrain following. It's a lot more common now that drones have that. The Matrice 300 has that capability. And I believe a number of the fixed wings drones do as well. So in those cases, you're either uploading topography information for the specific site that you're flying, or through the drone mission planner, you're able to select that area and they've already got that information loaded from maps that they use in the background. So terrain following drones for that, so that you're able to keep a consistent altitude above even as the elevation is changing. So if you set it to 120 meters flight altitude, you want that to be 120 meters from the ground, not just from sea level.
Fantastic. So really appreciate you joining me today, Emily. Just before you do go, if you just want to give us sort of the best sort of solution that you've come across with the MicaSense side, either the drone, the solution, the actual camera itself, that'd be fantastic. And then we'll call it a day. Sounds good.
So as far as the full, the sensor and drone software combination.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would say our three sensors are our Red Edge MX, and a brand new one we came out with, which is our Red Edge P that actually launched yesterday. And the 10-band system that I mentioned, our dual camera system, our Ultim system as well, which has the thermal. I would say the one right now that would be my recommendation would be the Red Edge P, the new one. it has a very high spatial resolution. So if you're flying at 120 meters, the ground sample distance would be 4 centimeters per pixel. So you're getting a high level of detail. If there's something in interest on the map, you can zoom in really close and be able to see what you're looking at in really good detail. For these kind of research applications we're looking at, you can fly lower, you can fly at 60 meters, and then you're getting 2 centimeter per pixel resolution. So it's all dependent at the flight altitude that you're flying. So this one has a very high spatial resolution. It's also utilizing a new technology. So we call it P for panchromatic band. So it's using a panchromatic sensor that has, it's a 5.1 megapixel sensor. And then you've got the 5 multispectral bands, 5 other lenses around it. So we're using that 5.1 megapixel sensor to essentially get a higher resolution for the multispectral. So we're pan sharpening the multispectral data to get that. So that's a way that we're able to keep the size of the camera small, keep it light, since that's very important for drones, but increase the spatial resolution. So that's going to be the latest technology we have available. You can have that with a Skyport, so the DJI Skyport on the Matrice 300 is a really good option right now, because you're able to get the flexibility of a quadcopter that can take off in a variety of areas, fly small areas or larger areas with more. It's a longer flight time compared to a lot of other quadcopters. And then for the processing, something like Pix4D fields that can give you the flexibility of having a really quick processing time, but also have a really simple workflow. So especially good if you don't have somebody who's a GIS analyst to take your data and process it and analyze it for you. You can use something like Pix4D, where it's very simple. I think it's like 4 different clicks you use to process, and then they have a variety of analytics pre-populated that you can select from for the analytics. So that would be my recommendation at the moment.
No, fantastic. And then obviously sort of the support, any sort of technical issues, or even sort of one-to-one masterclasses, that's something we can organize at a later date. But Emily, really appreciate your time today. It's been really, really exciting and interesting to listen to. Very enlightening, and I'm sure for a lot of people as well. If anybody's got any questions, any follow-ups, application processes, whatever it may be, shoot us an email, get in touch with us here at Coptrz. We can put you in touch with Emily if needs be. But the MicaSense products for a long time has been phenomenal. We're a really big fan of the brand, big fan of the application, and hopefully you will be too. So no, Emily, thank you very much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate everybody's time as well. It was great to dive into this today. So hope everybody has a good day.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.